This is a world where somebody can have over $100 billion. What is that? These fortunes are almost illegitimate unless in a very smart way given back.
One of the biggest names in business, tech, and philanthropy.
Exploring and investing in innovative solutions to some of the world's toughest problems.
Bill Gates.
Starting with Microsoft, where I had monomaniacal focus, giving up weekends and vacation. It wasn't some big sacrifice. I loved it. The idea that everybody would use a computer was somewhat ridiculed. So it was kind of fun saying, no, this is really going to be mainstream.
If you look at it from the outside, you see Steve Jobs and yourself having this competition, envy, jealousy. What was it actually like?
He said we were the General Motors and he was Mercedes. Social networking, we're still arguing about what the policy should be. Algorithms reward outrageous things, even if they're not at all factual. I've always underestimated how incredible my father was. He would say, hey, I'm sorry I worked so hard. And I'd say, no, that was fine. I feel lucky that he lived as long as he did. It brings tears to my eyes because he was incredible.
Do you remember one of the final conversations you had with him?
The #1 health and wellness podcast.
Jay Shetty.
Jay Shetty.
The one, the only Jay Shetty.
There's so much conversation today, I feel, about work-life balance. Do you think that that sacrifice and that dedicated time was necessary for the levels of success, or would it have been possible in another way?
No, I think for Microsoft to be successful, even though we were the first, we had a broader concept of software than the other companies, we needed to be what I would call hardcore. And, in that case, the work is what I want to do. It's not like, oh God, I've got to earn a little bit more money. It's, this is the thing that throughout my childhood, I was so lucky, because of my parents and some early friends, the school I went to, I had these exposures to computers that were very rare. And so I had, all these thousands of hours of programming experience and great feedback on, okay, how do you do it better from the very best adults? I got to see what was coming. And the idea of being part of making that real, I woke up and said, okay, I'd love to get to work. My younger self could stay in, days at a time. I don't do that now. But then it was just in no way a hardship. Because I felt we were part of something that would be very empowering. And, competitively, I wanted us to be the ones to make it happen.
One of your favorite quotes that I've always loved is you've said, we overestimate what we can do in 1 year and we underestimate what we can do in 10 years. At the beginning, did you over or underestimate yourself?
Well, people, when they would hear us say a computer on every desk and in every home running Microsoft software, they were like, you kids are really out of it. I mean, every desk, every home, what would people do with these things? But because the chips were improving exponentially, doubling every couple of years, it allowed us to think of the computing part as essentially being free. And so the only thing that would hold you back is, okay, can you help people with photographs? Can you help them with documents? Can you help them stay in touch with people far away or find information? And we knew over time that as these things got better, it would be part of the mainstream. And so as people sort of came around to that, they were like, wow, whether it's at work or at home, this is just part of how people do things. And we wanted, to get it out to everyone, students everywhere, even in the countries that are low income.
You mentioned your parents earlier, and when I was reading this book, I felt like they are such a big part of this book and the storytelling and the incredible experiences and memories. And one of the things you mentioned is you say that they felt that they accepted that you were different from your peers. And I was wondering, in what way? How did you know that they'd seen that and accepted that?
Well, it definitely confounded them that sometimes I was pushing back in a pretty tough way, as though, we were in some competition. They would hear from teachers, and they were very good about staying in touch with my teachers. Some teachers would say this kid should be skipped ahead 1 or 2 grades. Some teachers would say this kid should be held back. So that kind of is what, make up your mind. I had one experience where I worked on a report about the state of Delaware, and I ended up doing this 200-page report with the Great Wood cover. Well, the other kids turned in, 5 or 10-page reports. And it was very embarrassing that I thought, wow, did I, kind of overdo this thing? And yet, that ability to concentrate, would hold me in good stead in terms of reading long books and applying that concentration and curiosity first to cards, then to math, and then finally to software and how would software change the world. But, they never were quite sure what to do. And, sending me to a therapist actually ended up being brilliant, and sending me to a very nice private school where the classes were a bit smaller and, I always got an unfair share of attention from the teachers. We'd have like 15 people in the class, but, almost 20% of the teacher's time in terms of telling me what to read or, marking my writing up. I got an unfair share, partly because my curiosity or energy level, did mark me out in both positive and negative ways.
Yeah. What influence do you think Dr. Cressy actually had on you? Because therapy at that time and in your early age, looking back on it now, what do you feel it gave you? What skills did it give you?
Well, it was a very rare thing. In fact, the other people coming to him were these couples that were having arguments. And so I hope, privacy appropriate way, he would kind of give me a sense of that. He gave me a few IQ tests. He had me read about Freud and all these things. But slowly but surely, he was saying to me that fighting your parents really has no purpose. I mean, they really do love you. They're on your side. You should apply your energy towards other things. And, eventually he made me feel kind of foolish. Like, yeah, why was I taking these, what I thought were kind of arbitrary rules, or where my mom would say, you should respect me. And I'd say, well, I don't know. And a little bit, as I figured out, I could understand things like playing cards as well or better than my grandmother, or, I could read books that had complicated things. I was a bit showing off to saying, because my cognition is good, why should you be able to set arbitrary rules? But anyway, I'm embarrassed when I think about it now. But Dr. Cressy was so encouraging to me in general, and then got across. He probably understood at the first meeting, that I had to be convinced to make this change, but he did it in a super nice way. And so the idea that, no, my parents, yes, they're imperfect, but wow, they're on my side, that changed my behavior.
Yeah. And he also had these beautiful ways of, you said he never belittled you. And I believe he used to mention to you, you're going to win, or he wanted you to win. And I feel like that's, what did those things do? Because it's almost like you're saying he made you have this realization that you were wrong, but it seemed like he did it in a very graceful, elegant way. Like, how did he do that?
Absolutely. I thought, I need to be so clever to win, and I'm going to apply all this energy to win. And so the idea when he says, no, you're going to win, it's like, oh, I see. It's not because I'm clever. It's because it's us, they care for me, and they're trying, to help me. And, their main concern is, am I ready, to go out in the world? And if I have capabilities, will I develop those and use those? And, my mom always had a way of kind of pushing me to do more. I said to her once, you told me to go to the heart of school. And she said, no, I never actually said that. And I said to her, well, wait a minute. When other parents would come over, you'd say how bad they must feel that their kid didn't go to college or something like that. So, okay, it was indirect, but, it was kind of there. So, my mom certainly encouraged me, and sometimes I felt overwhelmed by that. But my eventual reaction to just, try to outdo any levels she set, and ended up working out well.
Yeah. What was something that you didn't value about your mom at that time that now looking back, you say, no, I do value that?
Well, things like table manners. I'm like, well, okay, I have to take the ketchup and put it in a bowl and then do this, and I'm not supposed to put my elbows on the table. And, she was just, trying to make sure I was civilized a little bit, what I would wear. And they definitely got me engaged with adults. My social skills were slow to develop with people other than a few boys like myself. But with adults, because they were having them over and I, got so I could ask those adults to talk about what they were doing, that was really valuable to me because I ended up through that and through one of my early friends having more of an outlook of, okay, where am I headed at quite a young age, which was super helpful.
Yeah, it's so funny. As I was reading the book, I was reminded of, so when I graduated from college, I didn't go to my graduation ceremony because I left to become a monk.
Wow.
And my parents they were very kind and accepting of my decision, but my mother still has this feeling that she doesn't have a picture of me graduating, wearing the hat and, holding my certificate. And I remember I was having the same feeling that you were, where my mom would always say to me, oh, when I go to my friends' houses, they're telling me about all the jobs that their kids are doing and the apartment they just moved into, and you're just there being a monk. Like, she'd say that to me. And it was always that kind of feeling, like that sense of pressure to live up to something she wanted me to do, even though there was love and there was acceptance. And I was wondering for you, like you said it yourself, she was such a powerhouse. She had such high expectations. When did you feel that you reached that? Or do you feel you've reached that?
Well, unfortunately, my mom passed away in her early 60s. She got breast cancer. And so I had gotten married 6 months before she passes away. So she never got to see that I tried to follow her example as a parent. She never got to see the foundation get going. My dad actually ran the foundation and got it off to a fantastic start. So he was involved. But her sort of dictate about, okay, if you are successful, you have to give back. It's a shame that she didn't get to kind of participate and see that I'm following what she said, despite all the times I pushed back on her.
Yeah. Do you still feel that today, that it's almost like her voice is in your head and she's present in that way?
Oh, absolutely. The sense I have of, okay, I've got to do this and do that well, that's, really came from her. My dad more set the example of being calm and thoughtful, also great values, but much, it wasn't through the interaction. He would, leave pretty early. And if my mom had to escalate to call him in, you knew you better give in because that was kind of the ultimate thing. But yeah, so each in their own way, he through example, her through high expectations, deserve a lot of credit. And, part of this book is to really honor them and two of the young friends I had who set me on a great path. Well, it's pretty insane. This is a world where somebody can have over $100 billion. I mean, that, what is that? You don't want to just give that to children and create some dynasty. That's not even a favor to them. Sadly, the wealth metric is an easier one to compute than, the impact you've had philanthropically. I have a good friendship both with Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. Elon stands by himself. Maybe that drives everybody else together. I don't know.
I was wondering, what was your biggest realization about your father from writing this book?
It's weird. I've always underestimated how incredible my father was. His values, even the exchange with my mom, before they get married. One of his dreams was to be a federal judge, and he eventually, that was offered to him. And because his law firm would have had great difficulties, he said, no, that would hurt my colleagues, so I'm not going to do that. And I had written him a note saying, gosh, I hope it's not because you had to pay all that tuition that you're not getting to do this. And I'd forgotten he'd written me back such a nice note. So, in digging through, I'm amazed we ended up keeping those things. It was so touching to me. I'll spend my whole life trying to live up to the example he set.
What was it like finding that reply, forgetting that he had replied? I mean,
Certainly it brings tears to my eyes because, he was incredible. And towards the end of his life, we did get a little more direct, where he would say, "Hey, I'm sorry I worked so hard." And I'd say, no, that was fine to be doing that, And so instead of things being sort of through my mom, when she was gone, he had to build up that communication. In a way, it was far more intimate. I feel lucky that he lived as long as he did.
How does that, as that relationship evolves, like it felt like when I was reading Source Code, I felt like your father was there to always save you in these moments. Like he'd pick up the phone, he'd be involved in, talking to you and your friends. Like he was there in these very pivotal moments that felt like almost professional support from him, of course, based on his intelligence and background as well. But it sounds like that evolved to a much more emotive, intimate space. Like what does that look like for a father and a son across all those years?
And when I was going off to college, I'd call my parents every couple of weeks, but, you couldn't like text and send photos. And so, but I always knew, that they were supportive. And so I actually got into a little bit of trouble where I'd taken my colleagues into the computer center and done some of the early Microsoft Basic work. And the college, as they filled position to supervise that computer center, were like, "Wow, did you break the rules?" And, my dad was always so kind of wise, whenever it was like, "Oh my God, I may have screwed up here. I better get on top of this." That's a time where I call him in and his advice is very helpful. Then later we have a customer who's not paying us, and our very first customer, another case where my dad encouraged me to stay the course. So it wasn't in those days that I talked to him a lot, but that when I was in trouble, he was the one person, who was so sophisticated and, on my side, that his advice really did help me at a lot of key turning points. And, then later when we have a relationship where we actually talk intimately, I was able to thank him for that.
Do you remember one of the final conversations you had with him? And
well, he got Alzheimer's, and because he was such a nice person, he was still like super nice, always worried, did his caregivers get enough meals? Or, eventually the fact he grew up in the Depression showed, because he'd be worried about, are we buying too expensive a meal? Even though he had as much money as he could ever need. So we got back to his basic character, which was just very friendly and thoughtful. So yes, I feel like in his case we did have those conversations that I never got to have with my mom.
There's the one phone call you described